let's pull up our lines without Dakota Joshua first. And I'll go first. Grady, you can pull up mine here. My lineup, Harm, I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to say Tocchet's got the best lineup he can right now, but very, very similar to what they have right now. Actually, that's exactly the same as what they have right now.
I was going to say, what's the difference?
I actually think that's the exact same as what they have right now. I thought I had something different.
I think the wingers are flipped on the fourth line. I think Podkolzin might be on the right and Oman might be on the left, but that's it.
Well, that's the recipe to success right there. It's Oman and Podkolzin just gotta switch, and you're fine. No, okay, this is very, very similar to what they're rolling with right now. And look, I think, and the one thing I'll say, the one thing I'll say is that I'd like to see Lindholm go up, Suter go to the third line. That might be the only tweak I make to this lineup. But right now, like, the lineup I wrote down is actually exactly what they're going with tonight. So hey, maybe I'm right and maybe Rick Tocchet's right. We have the same idea here on the Canucks' best possible lineup without Dakota Joshua. I'd say the only thing I want to kind of amend with this one is I might put P.S. Suter as third line center, move Lindholm into the top six, and Garland moves down to play with Miller and Besser. I think that's the only thing I'd say about this lineup. The only tweak I'd make to their current lineup, but I do like their lineup right now. I do.
I'm gonna mix it up a little. I am gonna reunite the Lotto line, and the reason I say this is because, first of all, you're gonna get Elias Pettersson hopefully going. JT Miller is the best line mate Pettersson has ever had. You look at their track record together; the on ice results have been crooked. So I'm going to go with that. And then I'm going to go with the second line of Höglander, Lindholm, Garland, a third line of Mikheyev, Blueger, Suter, and then Podkolzin, Oman, Lafferty on the fourth line. Like I said, I think the main point is getting Pettersson going, but also in this scenario, Lindholm has better line mates than Mikheyev and Lafferty. He actually has some offensive drivers to play with. You give him Höglander, you give him Garland. Those are two possession type guys that have at least some offensive touch compared to if he's playing with Mikheyev and Lafferty. I'll be honest, I don't have really any even strength offensive expectations for Lindholm. And then obviously because you're stacking your top six there, you got a third line of Mikheyev, Blueger, Suter, which definitely isn't sexy, but I think that works as a low event responsible. Just don't get scored online. And I'll be honest, how much worse is that third line than Lindholm, Lafferty, and Mikheyev? I'd argue it isn't that much worse. Now, I will say I'm doing this as like a temporary spark to try and get Pettersson going, to find some new combinations. This isn't something that I'd be rolling into, let's say, the playoffs necessarily, because you can afford to do this against, let's say, Buffalo, and you've got Montreal next, because they don't have very deep lineups. So you can sort of stack your top line, and you're probably still going to be fine with your second, third, and fourth lines being okay with their matchups. Obviously, as you run into opponents like Dallas and Vegas later in the season, that's when, for example, the Dallas quote unquote third line, which is really why Johnston, Stankoven, and Jamie Benn, that's where they'll probably feast on some of your weaker lines. But for now, considering the quality of opponents, I think this works to kind of give you a spark and just get a few guys going.
Okay, this is interesting that you said this, because Grady, pull up my lineup here with Dakota Joshua, because I love your thought process, Harm, of getting a spark going. I'm of the opinion that not only do I think Rick Tocchet won't do it, but I don't think they can do it. I don't think the Canucks can go to the Lotto line if that's the rest of their lineup with what we saw in your lineup. Like, I think it's fine, but I will point out that the only time we have seen the Lotto line to start games, like we're not just talking, when you and I bring it up here, we're not just talking about late in games you need a spark putting them together. We're talking about starting games and keeping them together all game. The only time we've seen it this year, and the only time we've seen it work, Harm, was when that third line was absolutely buzzing at the start of January. So I have them in my best possible lineup with Dakota Joshua. I've got Blueger back centering that line with Garland, Joshua, and then I've got a third line of Nils Höglander, Elias Lindholm, and P.S. Suter. I just think that's a much deeper lineup. Like, I think that's a third line that can compete with some of those top teams, and I just don't think you can afford to go with the Lotto line if Dakota Joshua was not healthy, but he gives you so many more options when he actually does return. So, like, I look at this and say this is a lineup that they could take into the playoffs and they could do damage in the playoffs with.
I don't know about playoffs again, just because teams are so much deeper. Again, a big part of it is you're playing Buffalo and Montreal next. Why can't like they aren't deep teams at all. They're both sort of, especially in Montreal's case, one line teams. I absolutely think if you have Lotto line together, that if Lindholm, like Lindholm, Hoglander, and and Garland would be a totally fine second line without Joshua, just for the interim to try and get Pettersson going. I think it matters to give him some help. Even if it comes at the sacrifice of, okay, where we're going to be trying to hold on for dear life with the rest of our lineup. Now, going to the playoffs with Joshua in, yeah, like I said, it's I don't mind it as like a plan B option, but I don't have the Lotto line together, which is kind of ironic because you'd think, oh, if I have them together without Joshua, I'd have them with. But this is more for a temporary spark, the case that I had for putting the Lotto line together. I've got something a little different for yeah, I've got it up here. So when Joshua's back in the lineup, I agree that you got to put them together, Joshua, Bluger, Garland, but I've got them as a third line. I've got Suter, Miller, Besser as your top line. It almost doesn't even matter who the third player with Miller and Besser is; they just always produce. And then I've got Hoglander, Pettersson, Lindholm. I think at some point Lindholm, you have to maybe give it another shot with him at wing, because I want to reunite that third line together when Joshua was healthy. They just had a different level of chemistry. The way they read off each other on the forecheck, pressure pucks. And so if you're not going to have Lindholm at 3C, then I mean, I'm not going to have him centering the fourth line. He's got to slot in on the wing, perhaps. And that's where I've got him with Pettersson. Hopefully, you're able to make that work.
I find it interesting. I like your lineup. I do. I don't like. Okay, in a perfect world, I'll say in a perfect world, or my ideal scenario, Elias Lindholm figures it out and works out in the top six, and I want him to be a top six winger. I said it yesterday. I really, again, it's such a hard question to answer because I think you need Lindholm to be playing better than he has been to make this lineup that you have work. But I don't disagree that it's a good lineup, especially if you get Lindholm clicking and really just playing like the player that they thought they were getting when they made this trade.
Yeah, the concern I had with your lineup with Lotto line is if you end up, let's say, going up against LA and they just go, or Vegas, and they just go, all right, we're gonna feed Philip Deneau to the Lotto line, and we're gonna go head to head. Or William Karlsson. Look at how effective Karlsson's line was against the McDavid line in the playoffs in the second round. If they just go, all right, we've got elite matchup centers, we're just gonna blanket and shadow you. Then in the playoffs, if you're able to neutralize the Lotto line, I'm not convinced they have enough scoring further down the lineup, especially if you're technically penciling in Bluger, Joshua, Garland. I like them a lot better as a third line. I don't love them necessarily as a second line in playoff hockey. That would be my only concern. But I think the point is, in either of us, in both of our scenarios, there is some sort of level of weakness, or there is some question mark, or there is some concern, because until Lindholm gets going, until you maximize his value offensively, you are a top 9 and or maybe even arguably a top 6 forward short.
I think that's a great take. I think a lot of this, like we can throw out line combos. We can talk about playoff potential and who's going to play against who and who the Canucks might face in round one. We can talk about all that. The big wild card here is Elias Lindholm. Like Elias Lindholm has to get going at some point. And again, if we look at the original lineup, he is going to be centering that third line, and he's not going to have the best wingers tonight. But we'll see how it goes tonight. Yeah, I thought that'd be a fun little segment. Let's see if people have any thoughts in the chat here. Seems pretty split. Nar said, I'm with Quads here, but partially because I think he likes squirrels more than Harm. Syndicat, Lindholm was always overrated. This is who he is. What do you make of that take, Harm?
I think he's got better to show offensively. Look, I think the hope of getting the 2021-22 version of Lindholm that was wheeling it around with Gaudreau and Tkachuk, my hopes are definitely down for that. Put it this way, I don't think he's going to reach the ceiling that I thought he would offensively when they first made the trade, but he's still better than this. Like, he has
Yeah,
to be better than this. I think
he
that's
has to be.
where I'm kind of at. Like, but expectations are definitely tempered, but the bar is still higher than where his actual performance level is right now.
Okay, this one is about Elias Pettersson. This one is from Karin. I got his name right. For future seasons, does this team just look for a scoring? Does this team look for a scoring winger for PD, or are they just waiting for Lekaramaki to develop? I don't think you have to have both, right? Like I think you can, like I think you can or excuse me, I think you can have both. Like, I don't think you need to pick one or the other. You don't need to go out and sign like, oh, we're gonna get a top six forward in free agency and we're gonna give him a lot of term and a lot of money. I don't think you have to do that. I think you can find kind of a stopgap. Like, I think you can find someone that can play with Elias Pettersson for the next 2 years. And I think you're hoping that Ilya Mikheyev has some sort of bounce back here and that you might have some of the answers in house, but I don't think you have to decide, okay, we're going to wait for Lekaramaki to develop, even though that might be the long term solution. The thing we always hear about Lekaramaki is he kind of projects more as a second line winger. Well, is Elias Pettersson going to be on the second line beyond just this season? We'll see. If so, maybe that's a really dominant second line that you can have. But look, I think the long term, you want Elias Pettersson being your first line winger, and I think you want to get him first line center, and you want to get him some actual first line wingers at some point.
Yeah, it should be a priority to get him some help this summer, this offseason. Of course, it's not going to be easy because you're not necessarily going to have a lot of cap space, and you've got other priorities in the sense that you're going to have to almost retool your blue line. You've got a lot of expiring contracts there. You've got some important decisions on UFAs. There are a lot of priorities to be juggling, but you should be aiming to give Pettersson some more help heading into next season because, look, most franchise centers have more help than Elias Pettersson has had this season. They usually have at least one really high quality running mate.
Oh, absolutely. This one from Roland. If Lindholm doesn't figure it out for the rest of the season and the playoffs, then what? Then he goes to UFA. He's gonna sign with a team, and it ain't gonna be an 8x8. Like it's not gonna be an 8x8. And we talked about this yesterday, so we won't repeat it all. But yeah, that rumored 8x8 contract, reported 8x8 contract in Calgary that was turned down, that might come back to haunt Elias Lindholm. But again, maybe he just didn't want to live in Calgary, right? Bring that up at least 3 times a week.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's nothing you can really do. You're just going to need to lean on other guys to step up. Then internally, you're going to need Hoglander to not just be at a top six caliber level on, let's say, 2/3 of every game, like 50 to 60% of games. You're going to need him to like be on almost every night, which is a lot to ask for a player who's only just reestablishing himself this season, who started in a fourth line role. But that's going to be the expectation. Um, you're going to need Ilya Mikheyev. You're going to need some level of, hey, can you show us a bit more? Sort of almost following up on what he's done maybe the last few games. You're going to need more from him. It's going to increase the pressure on a player like Pia Suter. It's going to increase the demands that, hey, once Joshua comes back, you need, not just want, you need the third line to get back to the level that they were before Joshua got hurt, which is part of, like, that's a question mark for me as well, is sometimes you find magical chemistry in season, and then for whatever reason, if there's a disruption to that, if there's an injury, you can sometimes put the same guys together again and you just don't get that same level of chemistry. Like, think about, different circumstances, but in 2019-20, for example, the Lotto line was one of the best lines in the NHL. They came back the next year in that shortened 56 game season, the same guys, and for whatever reason, they just weren't that dominant. They had to be split up. That's when we first saw Miller playing at center as a Vancouver Canucks. So that's something that I'm wondering about as well. Is I think a lot of us assume that when Joshua comes back, that it's going to give this lineup a massive lift, and I'm sure it will help, but it's not a guarantee that they're immediately going to pick up on the chemistry that they had before his injury. And that's something that you're going to need come playoff time if Lindholm doesn't find his form.
Canucks Conversation is live Monday through Friday, every weekday at 2 p.m. over on the Canucks Army YouTube channel. Make sure you like, subscribe, and interact in the YouTube live chat every day with us, folks.